So we are group 4 and our topic is the intellectual properties of the COVID-19 vaccines. My name is Michael Laughlin. My group mates are Wyatt Stamen and Gerardo Palacios. So to give you guys a brief introduction, our topic directly affects every single person in the world. The coronavirus has caused over 130 million cases and 2.82 million deaths worldwide. Not to mention, the long-term effects of the coronavirus are never ending. And some of the examples are mental health, remote school and work, and even daily routines. So overall, people are getting sick of this and want it to end in the best and safest way possible. But how can this be done? So to satisfy a 70% immunization rate around the world, you would need 11 billion doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. As of today, there have been 8.6 billion doses that have been ordered and confirmed. This is a great accomplishment, but these suppliers are being swamped with orders and are super backed up, and they're struggling to produce the required amount that's being asked of them. So 6 of the 8.6 billion doses are being scheduled to be shipped to the higher and upper middle income nations, and this leaves 1/3 of the remaining doses to be sent to the poorer nations. And the poorer nations they account for 80% of the world's population. So this is possible because the wealthier nations have the funds and the connections to be able to place these massive orders from the COVID vaccine suppliers, and it is also forecasted that it'll take over 2 years for these poor nations to be able to have a majority of its individuals vaccinated if we continue down this path. So to give you guys a better picture, I've added this graph. So it shows the 10 current vaccine suppliers and the amounts per supplier. As you can see that Oxford and AstraZeneca lead all suppliers with over 3 billion orders manufactured or confirmed. Next up is Novavax with 1.4, and then the ones that we are familiar with like Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. So what can be done? So countries have been putting up a fight to get the World Trade Organization to agree to a time-limited lifting of the COVID-19 intellectual property. And this fight is being fought by over 100 countries and led by countries such as India and South Africa. So the main argument is that vaccine suppliers should share their IP knowledge on the COVID-19 vaccine so more countries can start their own production. And many countries have yet to even begin their own vaccination efforts, and this would extremely help them and benefit them with this knowledge. So for decades, has been this debate of intellectual property rights and life-saving medicines, and it's kind of always ended in a stalemate, and there's just like a gray area on how this dilemma should be ruled. And the companies who are producing the COVID-19 vaccine are refusing to give up their knowledge and their IP and share it to the world. So this brings up the big question our group wants to discuss. So should the few companies who are creating the COVID-19 vaccine agree to share their knowledge and lose out on potential profits, or keep their IP secured and keep producing their own vaccines for the world?
It's been a year since the first COVID-19 infection was identified in South Africa. Since then, more than 50,000 people have died here and 1.5 million have been infected. While richer nations roll out vaccines, the program in South Africa has been much slower.
No person, no country, and no region must be left behind. Another important step is to enable the transfer of medical technology for the duration of the pandemic. This will allow us to increase the production of COVID-19 vaccines and other medical products.
South Africa and India are leading a movement to suspend the World Trade Organization's agreement on intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines. But many high-income countries, including the United States and those in the European Union, have rejected the idea. They say waiving the patents would put off private investors and slow down scientific innovation. And existing regulations allow drug manufacturers to make their own deals with generic manufacturers. While some developing nations like Ghana, Ivory Coast and Lesotho have begun receiving their first doses through the UN-backed vaccine sharing scheme known as COVAX, many others in Africa are being left behind.
There is capacity for pharmaceutical companies to produce these life-saving medical tools. It is essential that the wealthy states stop blocking or putting in legal barriers and delaying this essential proposal ahead of the TRIPS Council at the World Trade Organization.
According to the United Nations, 3/4 of all COVID-19 vaccines have been secured by just 10 countries, all of them wealthy. 130 countries, that's about 2.5 billion people, have not received a single dose.
This is not the first public health emergency that South Africa is facing. It has one of the highest HIV/AIDS rates in the world. In the 1990s, millions of people in this country and other developing nations died without access to the drugs they needed, simply because they were too expensive.
South Africa is once again calling for access to cheaper drugs to save lives, with some arguing that despite COVID-19 vaccines being tested in Africa, many nations on the continent still remain at the back of the...
Gerardo and Wyatt are going to be giving us their arguments for both sides on this issue. And Gerardo is going to start us off with advocating for the waiver of the intellectual property rights of the COVID-19 vaccines.
Hello, my name is Gerardo Palacios, and I'm here to talk about the cons of waiving, the COVID-19 intellectual property and making it more available to other manufacturers. The reason, with the whole problem of this is that the problem with patents is that patents, are originally created for businesses. They are created so they could create fair competition. And, the thing with COVID-19 is that it's a global pandemic. It's something that a lot of people around the whole world are affected by, and many people's lives have been put in risk, and a lot of people have been financially and emotionally affected by COVID-19. And making a waiver to let others use the intellectual property of COVID-19 is something that could help advance the production of vaccinations, and it could be more available to other countries and other people, specifically in underdeveloped countries, because in underdeveloped countries, a lot of these countries don't have the sufficient funds to acquire the vaccinations. And, that's the major problem with the whole, intellectual properties of COVID vaccinations. And, to get a little, more into the, effects of, COVID-19 and how the issue of how they are affecting, underdeveloped countries, is that there's a really big difference when countries don't have the money to get the vaccinations. So in 2021, according to the UN, the United States is projected to give 100 million vaccinations by the end of 2021. And in Europe, it's a similar occasion where there is projected to be 300 million vaccinations by the end of 2021. In underdeveloped countries, they're not expected to get vaccinations till the year 2022. And, with the effects of, underdeveloped countries not getting vaccinations, it increases their problems that they are facing, financially, emotionally, and also, how they're, trying to develop in the future, and this could cause a hindrance in their, progression. So according to the UN, there has been food shortages in these underdeveloped countries, and this has caused food to inflate substantially. For example, in Sudan, the cost of bread and sugar rose by 50%, and the inflation was a record of 167% and 144% in July of 2020. This is something that affects the people because, with COVID, there isn't many people working in agriculture or in manufacturing companies, due to not having sufficient, workers to make food. So this causes inflation, and people are not, able to get the proper nutrition. And another thing that, puts a struggle in these underdeveloped countries is that, it creates more money insecurity. According to the UN, there has also been a big, increase in, debt. And according to the UN, there is between 72 developing countries, they have to find a way to pay $598 billion between each other by the end of 2025. And with the hindrance of COVID-19, it makes things more difficult, and the money security creates anxiety, and it creates more of pressure on these underdeveloping countries. And this is something that are the effects of like COVID-19 and how it affects the growth of these countries. And there's also been other projects that have been trying to do this and help out. Recently Oxford University and AstraZeneca pledged to distribute 74% of its vaccines to developing countries. But the problem is that only 18% of these underdeveloped countries would be able to get vaccinations by the end of 2021. And these are ongoing problems that keep occurring because there isn't availability to vaccinations in underdeveloped countries. And this is why I am advocating for there to be intellectual and uplift and more availability to the intellectual properties, so countries and these companies are not so focused on capitalizing on the vaccines, and more about helping countries in a social beneficial way.
Hey everybody, I'm Wyatt Stamen, and I'm here to talk about why intellectual property rights to vaccines should be protected. Now, I have prepared a case that affirms the resolution resolved. Exempting COVID-19 vaccines from intellectual property protections will not speed up the manufacturing and supply of vaccines. Now, before I introduce my arguments, I would like to provide the observation that equitable and immediate access to vaccines is of the highest priority, and that the case I have prepared argues that the best way to access the vaccine, the best way to create access, to expand access to the vaccine, is achieved by protecting the intellectual property rights of the patent holders. I will now provide some background information that is necessary in evaluating the contentions that follow. So, before we talk about whether or not the intellectual property protection should be listed, it is important to note that intellectual property protections are in place for a reason, and that they are in place to foster innovation. It was innovation that caused the coronavirus vaccine to be developed in record time, and it is important to incentivize innovation. Now, without the protection of ideas, businesses and investors and individuals would not fully benefit from those inventions, and therefore, they would focus less on research and development. Like I said, the focus on research and development of a pandemic-ending vaccination was driven by financial incentive, and reducing the financial incentive to create a vaccine for COVID-19 also reduces the incentive for innovation and research and development into this vaccine. Furthermore, exempting COVID vaccines from let's get into the contentions. So the first contention is that intellectual property restrictions are not currently a restraint. And the second contention is that there are available alternatives that are much better, such as COVAX and licensing. And I'll explain what those are a little later. But the fact of the matter is, before I get into the contentions, is exempting COVID vaccines from intellectual property protection will not speed up the manufacturing and supply of vaccines, because intellectual property restrictions are not currently a constraint, because better alternatives exist. So let me explain a little bit why the intellectual property restrictions and protections that coronavirus vaccine manufacturing companies and patent holders have. So exempting the COVID vaccines from IP rights will not speed up the manufacturing and supply, because if it were the case that manufacturers who could and would manufacture additional vaccines, if not thwarted by intellectual property restrictions, there would be nothing to debate here. If there were companies on standby that were able and willing to produce the vaccine only if they had the intellectual property rights, this would not be a debate. But the fact of the matter is, lifting intellectual property protections on the patents of COVID vaccines would do nothing to speed up the manufacturing, because other restrictions exist. These restrictions include vaccination components, factory, training for the people who would manufacture it, legal complications, and lifting restrictions on intellectual property would cause, it wouldn't cause just infrastructure that doesn't exist right now in third world underdeveloped countries. It wouldn't magically make them come into existence. Lifting the intellectual property rights that's only a fifth of the battle. You still have to develop the infrastructure, you still need the vaccine components, and lifting these restrictions would reduce financial incentives for investments and initiatives to expand production. So keeping the financial incentive alive is essentially what's going to drive the access to this vaccine. It's also important to note that countries are already allowed to issue compulsory licenses to produce the vaccines without permission from the patent holder under a TRIPS, that's TRIPS, flexibility. Yet none have done so, and like I said before, it's because they're not capable. Now, there's another thing to mention is there's already existing pressure and financial incentive to scale manufacturing as quickly as possible. And I kind of hinted at this earlier, but there's a huge global demand for vaccines, and with a financial incentive to do so, there's also a financial incentive to expand access, and diluting the commercial incentive to pursue scale-driving horizontal collaboration is counterproductive. Now, I'm briefly going to talk about the alternatives to doing so because they're rather straightforward. The first one is COVAX, and this is an initiative of a bunch of investors that seeks to achieve fair, global, equitable access to the vaccine through its financing strategies. The thing is, this is going to be extremely expensive, and lifting the intellectual property rights won't make it any less expensive. It won't help raise the capital to take on a project like this. The COVAX plan depends on the investment in vaccine manufacturing, and if we take away the incentive to invest, it will slow down that substantially. The COVAX initiative pools the buying power of investors in vaccine manufacturing companies, which lowers competition and increases the flow of investment in manufacturing plants. Furthermore, evidence suggests the COVAX initiative will result in vaccines being produced much sooner. The second thing is licensing. We can totally avoid intellectual property restrictions and still get manufacturers the information that they need to produce this vaccine through private licensing. Through voluntary licensing. And voluntary licensing from vaccine companies can increase long-term manufacturing capacity when paired with this public investment that I was talking about earlier. Furthermore, they have an interest in enforcing safety and quality control standards, and that is important when gathering people to actually comply, because currently there is skepticism among the vaccines. So the fact that the IP restrictions aren't really a limitation to manufacturing, and the fact that there are alternatives we can pursue without losing these restrictions are reason alone to state that it is ethical for these vaccine companies to keep those intellectual property restrictions in place regarding the vaccine.
With vaccine development for COVID-19, pharmaceutical companies are certainly being very careful because we've had calls from different quarters, so ranging as far as France, all the way to China. We've had various comments from policymakers saying that the future COVID-19 vaccine should be treated as a public good. And that suggests that there is, as far as policymakers are concerned, an understanding that there could be potential weakening of intellectual property rights for a future successfully developed vaccine. And that vaccine would be priced at a level that allows it to be widely used on a global level. So that concept of public good is something that could be potentially sending warning bells for the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
But having said that, industry has had a lot of investment and commitment to purchase a vaccine, which allows them to start manufacturing at risk.
Yes, so Milena, to what degree does the pharma industry have to potentially forego patents and waive intellectual property and allow the generic industry to help scale up production of an effective vaccine and make it more widely available?
They don't have to. I think that there may be some pressure, but I think currently the industry's preference has been not to set a dangerous precedent in terms of weakening intellectual property rights. I think the preference has been to find alternative ways of manufacturing that would allow some of the low-income and middle-income countries to access a vaccine relatively.
After hearing both sides on this issue, I'm siding with Wyatt on him advocating for the IP protection rights for companies producing the COVID-19 vaccine. Protecting the IP rights is not an act of greed, but it's an act of making sure it gets done faster. I came to this judgment through his points and arguments on topics such as intellectual property protections being used as a sense of fostering innovation, profit-driven initiatives being used to meet demands, the COVAX initiative, and licensing agreements. All these points add up to reasons why the IP protection should stay in place for these companies. Thank you for joining us today. We will now open up the floor to questions.